Welcome to the Crime Redefined podcast, produced by Zero Cliff Media. Coming to you from the US Bank Tower, high above downtown Los Angeles. In our podcast, we drill deep into forensics and criminal investigation from the viewpoint of the defense, as well as explore the intersection of the media and the justice system.
I'm Dion Mitchell here with Mehul and Jaria. In today's episode, we will talk about what DNA can do and what it can't do in a case. You may be surprised by some of the limitations of its use in criminal cases.
It seems like the perception too often in criminal cases is that if the prosecution has DNA evidence, then it's game over. And also, I think there's the misconception that just because there's DNA, there therefore must be guilt.
You know, I certainly thought that before you set me straight, but isn't DNA the gold standard of forensic techniques?
It absolutely is. If you compare it with the other forensic techniques, with DNA, we can test very old evidence. There's a lot of science behind it. Most importantly, we can put that statistic, the 1 in 38 million. But within DNA, not all of the tests are the same. So think about a situation where you have a very limited amount of DNA. You may not get a full battery of results. In other words, let's say you're looking at 20 genetic markers, but you only get results at 2. I like to explain that as kind of like a partial license plate. So let's say you're trying to identify a car and you say, well, I know the first number of the license plate is 7. It's information, but how good is it? So sometimes the statistical power of DNA is not that 1 in a quadrillion or something like that. In a way, DNA has become almost too sensitive. We can pick up every little trace of DNA, and we don't necessarily know how long it's been on an item, or we don't necessarily know what sort of body fluid was responsible for it. And again, there's a number of DNA technologies. So some of them are male specific. So all paternal relatives will have the same DNA type. So when we talk about DNA in forensics, it's kind of a hodgepodge of how powerful it might actually be.
It's funny. It makes me think about over the years we've been working together, and you've continually brought up interesting cases of DNA transfer and paramedics. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, yeah, there's a classic case. This goes back to 2012. Homicide case in the Silicon Valley. The defendant was Lucas Anderson. So a wealthy businessman is murdered, and during the investigation, there's a number of pieces of evidence they pick up. There's some duct tape. Interestingly enough, the perpetrators used latex gloves, so they were somewhat cognizant of leaving DNA behind. But these gloves were actually found in a sink with water and soap on them, as if they were trying to wash off the gloves. And then finally, as they do in homicide investigations, they looked at the fingernail clippings from the victim. So they got, I think, hits on 3 different people from the duct tapes, the gloves, and the fingernail clippings. Now, duct tape and gloves, when you looked at the individual hit on, they said, okay, I could see there's some association here. If we look at the cell phone evidence, we look at maybe the MO, some of the gang relationships. But the person that hit on the fingernail clippings, that connection was a little bit more tenuous. So they arrest this guy, Lucas Anderson. He's sitting in jail for a good month, and his defense attorney's talking to him, and he's saying a little bit too much. He's saying, you know what? Man, I drink a lot. I don't know what I might have done. So the defense attorney's like, hey, wait a minute. Just pipe down. So they look into it, okay? And they figure out that on the night of the homicide, Mr. Anderson was passed out drunk in the front of some store to the point where the paramedics had to pick him up and take him to the hospital. So as they looked into this, Anderson had an airtight alibi. He was literally in the hospital, passed out drunk during the time of the homicide. So how is it that Mr. Anderson's DNA ends up under the fingernails of a homicide victim when he clearly couldn't have been there? One thing was in common. The same paramedics that picked up Mr. Anderson drunk also went to the homicide crime scene. So somehow, some way, they transferred Mr. Anderson's DNA to the fingernails of the homicide victim. Scary, huh?
Yeah, not only is it scary. I mean, you couldn't, you couldn't script that, even if you wanted to think it up that kind of a transfer. But it's crazy to think that that's a real world illustration of DNA transfer, not just some case theoretical defense. Some case of a theoretical defense that's grasping at straws. But I wonder in the courtroom, when that went before a judge, what people were thinking.
Yeah, exactly. And then you think about, well, gosh, I mean, paramedic transfer, were they covered in blood? Were they sloppy? But this just goes to the point that all it takes is a little bit of invisible DNA. So one of the theories was that the mechanism of transfer might have been the pulse oximeter. So that's the little thingy that, you clip on the finger and you can take some vital signs. Right. So if that was clipped on Anderson and then later clipped on the homicide victim, that small amount of DNA might have transferred.
There's two looks at that. And one is it's obviously it's scary because you could find yourself in a world of hurt and in trouble by this transfer. But at the same time, the technology today that they were able to pick up that level of DNA or that, small amount of DNA and have it, show up in the testing it's really astonishing.
But look at how DNA blinded everybody. It's like, aha, we got a DNA hit. We're able to arrest somebody. Case closed. So because DNA is not always so absolute in terms of context, you still have to go pound the pavement and do the detective work. And it's exactly because that was done that Mr. Anderson, found his airtight alibi. And this is the problem. People don't understand DNA. So it's surprising with my attorney and inmate clients how many times they come to me and say, yeah, they got this DNA, take a look at it, see what you can do. And I'll come back with, some holes in the evidence or some alternate explanations. And very often I'm telling them, hey, you know what? There is some good news here.
That's a great point. And you've mentioned that to me a number of times. And that is, look, you can have DNA, you can get it tested, it can point somewhere. But at the end of the day, it still comes down to boots on the ground and the detective work.
Absolutely.
Someone has to explain where the DNA came from. It just doesn't show up on its own. And now, just by your example, there's tons of ways that it could show up.
Absolutely true. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
I would say, what are some of the other instances of misleading contamination? So you got my mind working now.
Yeah.
In DNA cases. I think you mentioned one a few months ago about a mishap that occurred in Germany, which it's nice to know. That's not nice, but it's interesting to know that we're not alone. Not all of the stuff is just in the States.
Yeah, this is universal, absolutely. So in Europe, in Austria, France, and Germany, there was essentially 40 cases that were linked by DNA between 1993 and 2009. And it was an array of types of crimes. There were 6 murders, but then the rest of the crimes, the other 34, they were anywhere from burglary to other types of things all the way up to murder. And so the common theme here was that there was DNA from a female. So people were thinking, wow, we've got a female serial killer. And this person was nicknamed the Phantom of Heilbronn. So in 2009, in France, they were investigating a burned male body, and they took some DNA samples from that body, and when they tested it, it came back with female DNA. And they're thinking, well, what the heck? We know this is a male. So that gave them some pause for concern. And also when they looked at these 40 crimes, it was like they were spread out geographically. There was a different MO. There were different types of crimes, and it just wasn't adding up. Ultimately, what they found out is that the swabs that were used to collect crime scene DNA all had been contaminated by a woman working at the factory where they were manufactured. So all of these swabs have the same person's DNA, and it's coming up as an artifact in all of these cases. So again, it was the DNA was extremely blinding, and you had to do that boots on the ground investigation to get to the bottom of this. So, Dion, you're probably asking me, come on, these are scientists. How could they have prevented that?
Yes.
Okay. So, in science, one type of protection we have against this is we can run something called a negative control. So just imagine if you're at a crime scene and you say, you know what, before I collect all these samples, I'm going to take one swab, I'm going to add the sterile water to it, and I'm going to package that separately, and that's my negative control. And that will tell me if I had any DNA on my swab or water to start with. So had they done that, this would have never happened.
Yeah, this gets into kind of a scary territory where you almost need to, kind of trademark your DNA, so in case it does inadvertently get transferred somewhere else, that you're not having the law knocking on your door.
Well, two things on that. As a result of this case and other things, the manufacturing standards of DNA analysis materials have been tightened big time.
I guess that's just kind of the growth and the maturity of the I guess of DNA in legal cases, but then also of the supporting industry.
Absolutely, absolutely. So to your other point, nowadays, crime labs will maintain databases of DNA profiles of all of the detectives, police officers, and crime scene investigators exactly for this point.
Right. So that's part of the maturity of, of these cases, so they can automatically exclude, kind of the immediate circle around a particular case.
Yeah, exactly. So, if I'm in court and I'm talking about innocent DNA transfer from a defense perspective, some people might think, well, yeah, there's some rare occurrences where some weird transfer happens. But I always talk about the extreme cautions that DNA labs use to prevent contamination when working with evidence. I mean, we've all seen the pictures of the labs, people wearing gloves, people with masks on, high-tech labs, working with shields in front of them. But I'm here to tell you, nevertheless, labs have a lot of instances of the analyst's DNA being found on the evidence. Now, is it because they're sloppy? Well, maybe. But to me, that's more a testament of how easy it is to transfer minute amounts of DNA.
But in the big picture, it's got to be rare, though, right?
Overall, yes, it is. Thankfully, this is rare. And as you said, as we learn more, we can prevent these occurrences. It's like, we have to go all the way back to the manufacturing, or, hey, we shouldn't be talking over evidence. And so it is becoming better and better. But what's interesting is at the same time, the DNA tests are becoming more and more sensitive, which means we're going to have to be more and more careful.
Well, let's flip that on its head a little bit. And obviously you work mostly on the defense. So tell me about DNA cases in which the defense could exploit some of the uncertainties of DNA.
Well, I like to think of a very topical example, and that's an officer-involved shooting. And so let's say that, hypothetical case, that the allegation is that the defendant was struggling with the police officer and, in fact, was trying to get a hold of the police officer's gun in his holster. And let's say that is the reason that the officer shot the defendant. So then you say, well, wait a minute, can we use DNA to see if that is true? So obviously you could swab the officer's gun and holster and look to see if there's DNA. And then, perhaps that would tell you, yeah, sure enough, the defendant was grabbing for the guy's gun, so it's a justified shoot. But, you think about it, let's say that a officer has contact with a suspect and he's maybe shakes his hand, and then he touches his gun. So the officer already has DNA from the defendant on his hand and then touches his gun. Or let's say they're talking in close proximity and the defendant perhaps is sweating or he's spitting, or maybe they're in a struggle, but in the struggle, it's not that the defendant grabbed the gun, but his arm brushed up against it or his clothing. So just finding that person's DNA in the gun or the holster, because of all of these limitations of transfer DNA, doesn't necessarily tell you that they went for that gun.
Right. And then that's how the defense could basically cause some doubt in front of the jury.
Absolutely, because there's no test on that gun that's going to say, oh, this is cells from a hand, that we can say that's specifically how the DNA got there.
And have you seen where that's actually that defense worked?
Yeah, I can think of years ago where I was on the other side of this, where it was a civil case where I was working sort of on the other side. I did the DNA testing, and yeah, there was some DNA from the defendant. There was some DNA from the cop. And on one hand, I guess it corroborated the claim that the guy reached for the gun. But on the other hand, it may not because of the DNA transfer. And honestly, I don't remember the defense on that case particularly. That was a number of years ago where I think the DNA transfer defense wasn't quite as prevalent.
Okay, so that makes me, with everything that we've talked about, what are some interesting research projects, if there has, and that you know of, that have been conducted on the issue of DNA transfer?
Well, I tell you what, let me give you a couple more real-world cases here, and then I'll talk about some of the studies. I mean, studies are good because they tell us what theoretically is possible, but they're under very controlled conditions. So I like the real-world examples, even better. So one thing that comes up in investigations very often is DNA under the fingernails, like we talked about in the paramedic case. So I had a homicide case where the victim was found shot in the backseat of a car, and they went ahead and swabbed the fingernails. And under one of the fingernails, they found, okay, there's blood and there's DNA from two people. One person is the victim. You'd expect his own DNA would be under his fingernails. But they had enough of a DNA profile from the second person to go ahead and put it in CODIS, and they got a hit on a guy. Well, the guy that they hit on...
okay, let me pause you right there. Just for everybody listening, give me CODIS again.
CODIS is essentially the national DNA database that's maintained by the FBI. It stands for the Combined DNA Index System.
Okay.
So based on this CODIS hit, they went and arrested this guy. Well, if you looked at this guy, he kind of looked like a murderer. I mean, gang affiliation, tattoos, all of that kind of stuff. But what the police believed is they said, aha, we have got the blood of this defendant under the fingernails of the victim. Therefore, there was a violent struggle, and we've got our guy. So they struggled, and then, he got shot. But what I pointed out is, number one, is that if you have a sample where there's blood and DNA from two people, that does not mean that both people bled. In fact, it's reasonable to assume that the guy who was shot, that it's his blood, but the DNA from the second person could have been from anything because it was a relatively low level. And come to find out that victim and suspect had some casual contact, I think, the day before. So that could have very easily explained his DNA under the fingernails without a violent confrontation. And actually, in this case, he was found not guilty.
Wow, that's big in a case, and it really kind of paints the picture that DNA evidence has a lot of gray area.
Well, you can't stop if you get the DNA, you cannot stop your investigation. That's really the moral of the story here, because if that falls apart in court, you may not have anything else.
Yeah, and I could see the look for the prosecution thinking they've got a slam dunk.
Yep. And
then when you come in and you lay that out and say, hey, listen, they had contact before, because once again, you can't timestamp the transfer.
Exactly. Another example, case some years ago, the allegation was that a woman's boyfriend had killed her baby, basically got annoyed with the baby crying and hit the baby in the head with a gun, essentially pistol whipped an infant. And so he went to jail. First trial was a hung jury. So the second trial came along. I was actually involved. And so the crime lab looked at the gun in question, and they didn't find any hair or blood on the gun. And they swabbed basically three areas of the gun. I call it the 3 points of the gun: the muzzle, the butt, and the hammer. The areas where you could strike somebody, with the gun. And there was some of the baby's DNA on the gun. There was some of the defendant's DNA. But what does that tell you? I mean, It tells you that somebody's probably a bad parent because, having a baby's DNA on a gun is just not a good thing. But now that doesn't mean that gun was used to strike the baby. So again, let's go to DNA transfer. What is a better source of DNA than a baby, right? They're throwing up, they're crying, they're spitting up, you're constantly holding them. So of course you're going to have your baby's DNA on your hand. And then if you go touch a gun, it's going to transfer there. Also, if I remember...
Okay, quick question. That actually kind of makes my head explode just a little bit, is that there's another thing. You can't timestamp the transfer of DNA.
Right.
You also cannot show the direction of the DNA. Because right now, in the beginning of you explaining this to me, you're thinking, okay, gun to baby's head, not baby to on the person to the gun.
So gun to baby's head. Direct transfer of baby's DNA to gun.
Right.
Baby to defendant to gun, secondary transfer of DNA. This is what it all boils down to. Whereas secondary transfer was not really recognized, say, I don't know how many, 15 years ago. Now, because of experiments and the sensitivity of testing, we realize, this is very possible, and this has to be considered in the equation.
Wow. So then that brings me to my next question, or what are some of the tech advances on the horizon that may plug some of these holes in DNA evidence?
Well, one of the big holes would be we get this DNA, but we don't know from what part of the body it came from. So let's say that you've got a young girl, maybe the accusation is there's some sort of molestation, that somebody was touching her where they shouldn't, and maybe on her inner thigh there's some level of DNA from the male. But, let's say that she was wearing shorts and she sat on the couch in the guy's house, or she sat in his car, and, so there could be DNA transfer. We just know it's DNA. We don't know it's from a hand. And so as it stands, we've got tests that are pretty good for confirming the presence of human blood, for confirming semen. That's an easy one. You can see sperm under the microscope, and saliva. But there's so many other sources of DNA. You could get it from perspiration. You could get it from skin cells, all sorts of things that we can detect the DNA, but we can't identify where in the body it came from. So, you think about, say, an oral copulation case, a penis swab, and you get a low level of female DNA, and let's say you're not able to detect saliva. Well, could that be from oral copulation? Yeah. Or could the male have had contact with the female, got DNA in his hands, touched himself, and transferred it that way? We don't know. Surprisingly, there is no test that will identify vaginal fluid, if you can believe it. So the same problem, if you get female DNA in a penis, you can't necessarily say that is from vaginal cells. So some of the technology we're looking at is getting away from some of the standard old school ways of identifying body fluids and looking more at things like not DNA, but actually the RNA, or looking at different characteristics of DNA, such as DNA methylation. So this will be great when we can identify the specific type of body fluid with the DNA.
You started to touch on it, and we got a little in the weeds there, but could we get to a point where you could actually pinpoint, like you said, the body part, not the fluid, the part of the DNA? Can you drill that far down, or would you think they might be able to in the future? Like, for example, like you said, is DNA, let's say the DNA is all the same. It is all the same from one person, right? But if I touch you with my hand versus maybe with my foot, that obviously in a courtroom could have a huge impact. That it would be more able to say, hey, look, this is what was going on, paint a better picture of what was going on at the time of a confrontation. Right?
Well, literal body part, boy, I don't know. But being able to say, perspiration versus something else.
Right.
Yeah, and even blood is interesting, right? Because you could have a situation where, hey, was this from violent bloodshed or was it menstrual blood? And there's definitely some techniques, especially with the RNA, that you can differentiate the two. So I don't know that we'll ever get mapping the particular area in the body, but we'll be able to say, hey, this came from this type of fluid versus this.
Wow, this is really interesting stuff, and it gets me kind of chomping at the bit to go into a recent case, high-profile headline, the Golden State Killer, but we'll have to save that one for another time.
Yeah, that's another technology. And let me give you one more here just to close out. So let's say that I'm going to go back to fingernails because that's all the rage in these interesting cases. And there was a case in New York a few years back. Defendant's name was Oral Nick Hillary. And a young boy was murdered. Again, looking at the fingernails, there was a mixture, the young boy's DNA and someone else's. So the crime lab looked at it and said, yeah, there's a mixture here, but we can't really interpret it. It's just too complex. And so the DA said, I'm aware of some technology here. And just to drop a little lingo here, probabilistic genotyping, which is essentially using computer models to better interpret tricky DNA mixtures. In other words, you can look at more data points and more parameters and possibly make some conclusions on something that might have been inconclusive. So the DA sends it off to one company and they say, you know what? We did all our fancy whiz-bang computer stuff. We agree. It's inconclusive. So the prosecutor says, I'm not happy with that. I'm going to go to another commercial company and I'm going to see if they can resolve it. So this company actually comes back and says, you know what? Yeah, Mr. Hillary is possibly included. Well, you can imagine that this was met with a fierce battle in court. So ultimately, when it went to court, it was ruled that they could not introduce this evidence. I mean, come on, what are we doing? Best 2 out of 3 here?
Yeah, right. That you're basically shopping around for your conclusion.
Right. So, okay, as you alluded to, we talked about CODIS and hits, and I guess the next part of the frontier is genealogy, and we'll talk about that next time with the Golden State Killer.
Fantastic. I'm looking for it. Thanks,
All
Michael.
right.
Thank you for listening to the Crime Redefined podcast. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter at Crime Redefined. Please send us your comments and questions and join us for the next episode.